And today I'm just going to be continuing, as I have been, teaching through Matthew's Gospel, which section 6 of Matthew's Gospel is where we've been as I have outlined it. And section 6, once again, is roughly from the end of chapter 20, which is where we see Jesus healing the blind men outside of Jericho, all the way through Matthew chapter 25, which is the Olivet Discourse, or the very end of the Olivet Discourse. And I've titled all of that section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders, because most of what he says and does in this section really is a direct condemnation against many of the things that the people are doing at that time. And this is his last chance really before his crucifixion to say these things, and so he is doing that before he goes off to the cross. Now within section 6, we're currently studying what I have called the third portion of that section. So again, in my outlining, we go from the gospel to sections to portions. And this third portion is the scene where all these different leaders and groups of the Jews are coming to Jesus with these questions, and he is answering them. And I have titled this portion, The Insightful King Silences the Fools, which I think for the most part does a good job of summarizing all that's happening in this particular portion. You certainly see the insight of Jesus. You see the foolishness, by contrast, of many of these Jewish leaders. You see him silence them, and I think this ends on a very strong royal note. Hence, the insightful king silences the fools. All of that is what we've been doing for a while now. In this portion, we've come to the third question, which is from the Pharisees, and we'll go ahead and read that now. We've been through the question of the disciples of the Pharisees with the Herodians, and then the question of the Sadducees, and now we come to the Pharisees themselves with their question, which is in Matthew 22, verse 34, and we'll read through verse 40. It says, "But when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him, 'Teacher, which is the great commandment of the law?' And he said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets.'" Now this third question aimed at Jesus has such an important answer that I've decided to teach 5 messages on it total. I was going back and forth between 5 and 6, but I've decided on 5. So this is message number 2, really, in what we're doing. Last time I taught a message called Biblical Definitions of Love, which is exactly how it sounds. It is, for the most part, the results of a word study I did several years ago, trying to get a biblical definition for love. And in all that effort that I put into it, I came up with 2 of them. One of those definitions was active delight in something, and the other was sincere kindness shown to someone. And I just spent the last sermon going through those and giving you my reason for that. Hopefully, understanding those definitions of love will help us be able to follow what Jesus says here as he talks about these 2 great commandments about loving God and loving your neighbor. It'll give us help in practicing love, but also confidence in that we know that we're practicing love if we understand what those words mean. So that was last time. As for today's message, my focus is targeted more at understanding how these 2 great commandments function in this conversation between the Pharisees and Jesus, and also in the entire Gospel of Matthew. So here we're really coming back to this passage as it is for us in this Gospel and in this part of Jesus' ministry, and trying to figure out really why is this here, and trying to gain some insight from that. Today's sermon is called Blind Hatred, which is the phrase that came to my mind after I was done studying all that happens in this interchange between the Pharisees and Jesus. So blind hatred. And in this passage, I think the answer of Jesus to the Pharisees exposes their ignorance of their own hatred. I think that is what's truly happening here as we study the passage and figure out why Jesus answers them the way he does, and why this was included by Matthew at all in his gospel. And in this, I think the Pharisees become an example of the great threat we all face, which is thinking we love other people or love God while having no love whatsoever. It seems to be a rather common problem, and the Pharisees put themselves forward as a great example of this, and I think this passage is here as a warning for anyone who might fall victim to the same problem. My sermon today is all largely aimed at that, and I have 5 headings for you that I will give to you here and now as my outline before we get moving through all the details. My first heading is that Jesus answers this question with a common teaching about the primacy of love. So that meaning that when Jesus gives his answer would have been somewhat expected, even in his own day. Second heading is that the Pharisees hate Jesus rather than love him, which is the kind of thing that almost goes without saying, except that I find no one really says it when talking about this particular passage. So I want to be sure I say it and talk about it in my sermon today. Thirdly, in his reply, Jesus makes extra effort to address the hatred of the Pharisees. I think that motive explains quite a lot of what happens here in this particular passage and why Jesus says all that he says. Fourthly, the Pharisees not only hate their neighbor, Jesus, but they also hate God, which is kind of a surprise twist that I think Matthew tries to show us in a certain detail that he includes here. And then finally, my fifth heading, that Christ shows his own moral insight against the immoral foolishness of his enemies. And that again brings us back to the real purpose of this whole portion and how Jesus answers these men and why Matthew records all of this and what he's trying to show us about Christ in the middle of it all. So those are the 5 headings for today. But again, I want to remind you of the purpose for this sermon, this particular sermon in this small series that I'm doing. And the purpose really is self-examination. I want us to really consider this great threat that I mentioned earlier, exemplified by the Pharisees, this great threat that we think we love when we actually have no love. That, I think, is the threat we face as we talk about love. And that is a lesson really for everyone here, whether the children or for the adults. That's something you never really outgrow. But something I did want to say to the children in particular, just as we get moved up here, just as we get moving along here, just that these commands from Jesus, especially the commands today, where he talks about loving God and loving your neighbor, they're pretty easy to understand. I know that whenever Chad and I are up here teaching, or maybe when you're reading the Bible and talking about it with your parents, there's a lot of stuff that's not so easy to understand. The command to love God and love your neighbor are pretty simple by comparison. However, the commands are easily understood and for the same reason also easily broken. I mean, it's the kind of thing where you can hear about this and just not do it. And that is really the great threat that we have with such simple teaching, that it's easy to understand and therefore you have even less excuse when you don't do it. So it's very easy to break these in the worst possible ways. And it gets harder as you get older, really, when you think about it, because you find all new ways to hate people, ways that you never even really thought possible when you were younger and just didn't know as much about the world or as much about people. You find all new ways to hate people as you get older. You find all new reasons to hate them, and it therefore makes it all the more difficult to love people, as Christ commanded. So really, this command, as easy as it is to state, brings with it its own kind of difficulties. And the worst part of it is, though, that people can say with their mouths that they love God or that they love other people, while their hearts are not full of love at all, but rather full of hatred. People can talk about love and praise love and say many great things about love, but not practice it at all in their actual lives. Now, thankfully, God will place us in situations which become occasions to test ourselves to see if we truly live by these things. If you are following God in any way, God has that desire to perfect you, to actually teach you, to bring you along in the way of righteousness. And God will actually test you and make you see the times in your life when you do not practice love toward others and make you see the lovelessness in your own heart. God will do that. And those become our occasions to examine ourselves and make sure that we're actually falling in line with these 2 great commandments. The Pharisees, however, in a sense, had their own test and failed it. The Pharisees thought they were testing Jesus. It says specifically that this lawyer is testing him with the question. Really, they were the ones being tested, and they were the ones who failed the test. They failed by showing their own lack of love toward Jesus as they interacted with him throughout his ministry. And their failure has then become our opportunity to learn how to do better. As we study this passage, we see in them the negative example against which we should frame our own obedience. That is what I hope will happen today as you consider this passage and the particular things about it that I have in mind for today. So please don't get too far away from the real goal here, to examine ourselves and make sure we're not following a similar error as the Pharisees were practicing back then. So let's go on to the first heading here. For the first stage of this sermon, I want to argue that Jesus answers this question with a common teaching about the primacy of love. My whole argument here is that what Jesus says would have been an expected answer back in his own day. And that probably sounds very strange to you. It certainly sounds strange to me, even as I say it. It's so strange because we're accustomed to Jesus displaying remarkable insight. I even made that the chief theme of this whole portion of Matthew, where he answers questions in ways that no one even really thought to answer them before. That was certainly the case in the first question and the second question regarding taxes and then regarding the resurrection. There was a real difference there in the way Jesus handled those things. We're accustomed to that. To say that Jesus provides a common answer seems somewhat to steal from the glory of Christ, at least the glory of Christ that we're accustomed to encountering in the Gospels. He usually answers things in ways that are very unusual, and in being unusual are actually very, very striking and have a profound impact. In this case, he gives what I think is a common answer. However, I think the insightfulness of Jesus in this conversation with the Pharisees is best seen when we realize that his answer was indeed common. I think the best way to see what Jesus is really doing here and why it is so remarkable is to start with that observation that his answer is pretty by the book in terms of first century Judaism. So let's talk about that. I have 3 pieces of evidence to prove that this was actually a common answer back in the days of Jesus. My first piece of evidence is Mark's account of this same event. So we're going to jump over to Mark's Gospel, and that is Mark chapter 12, which you can go there if you want to. I'm going there just so I have to read it, but you don't necessarily have to go there. We won't be there wrong. But this is Mark's account of the same event. It is Mark chapter 12, verses 28 through 34. As usual, you will see the similarities and differences. But for now, I'm focusing on one detail in particular. Mark 12, verse 28 through 34 says this: One of the scribes came and heard them arguing, and recognizing that he had answered them well, asked him, "What commandment is the foremost of all?" Jesus answered, "The foremost is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." The scribe said to him, "Right, teacher, you have truly stated that he is one, and there is no one else besides him, and to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as himself, is much more than all burnt offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that he had answered intelligently, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." After that, no one would venture to ask him any more questions. We see in Mark's account that the scribe who raised this question agreed with Jesus, which is a very rare thing in the pages of the Gospels to see one of these scribes actually agreeing with Jesus. Not only did the scribe agree, but he agreed enthusiastically. He gives this pretty little speech after Jesus has done answering the question, basically saying, "You're right." And not only is it a very much an agreement, but it's very eloquent. He has this very well put together, almost like it was from some sermon he himself had taught at some synagogue, at some point in his own past. It seems to me that this scribe already believed that the two greatest commandments were loving God and loving your neighbor. It just doesn't seem like the kind of thing where he never thought about this before. The quickness and the enthusiasm and the eloquence there tells me that these were already the thoughts on his mind when he asked the question to Jesus. Otherwise, I don't see how the scribe could have been so eager and eloquent in his agreement with Jesus on this occasion. And that is why Mark's account is my first piece of evidence that the answer of Christ was a common teaching. We have one scribe in Israel at least who seems to have already believed all of that before he had his conversation with Jesus. So there's my first piece of evidence. My second piece of evidence is the similar event recorded by Luke in his gospel. So you can turn there if you want to, but again, we won't be there for very long. This is Luke chapter 10. This is not the same event. This is actually a different event, but it's very similar, and therefore it's going to have some bearing on our conversation about this passage today here in Matthew. This is Luke 10, verses 25 through 28, where we see this happen. And a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And he said to him, "What is written in the law? How does it read to you?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." And it then goes on into the parable about the Good Samaritan. We don't have to read that right now. We will get around to that at a later part in this series. But right now, I just want you to see that exchange there at the beginning between Jesus and this lawyer. The similarities between this passage and our passage today are several. You have a lawyer putting Jesus to the test with a question of great importance, which is answered by two commandments: to love God and to love your neighbor. Very, very similar with our passage over there in Matthew 22. However, in Luke's account, did you notice that the scribe himself, or the lawyer himself, says that loving God and loving your neighbor are a good summary of what God requires? It's actually him talking. Jesus doesn't give that answer. He just says, "Yeah, you're right," after the lawyer's done answering. So that is what happens here in Luke's account of this parable of the Good Samaritan, or the beginning of it. But that means then we now have a second scribe in Israel at the time of Jesus who seems to already believe that loving God totally and loving your neighbor as yourself are a good summary of what the law requires. We've got the scribe that was talking to Jesus in Jerusalem toward the end of his ministry, and now we have this guy here asking this question at this time earlier on in Luke's gospel. So we've got two different scribes now in Israel, or two different lawyers, teaching that loving God and loving your neighbor are a good summary of the law. Which, I mean, it seems like a pretty big coincidence if just two guys, and only two guys in the whole country, arrived at this point. It seems like we're getting a lot of traction here for the possibility that this was a common teaching back in the days of Jesus. Now, I do have one more piece of evidence for you, and this third piece of evidence comes not from any of the Gospels, but from an earlier Jewish writing called the Testament of Dan. You know that I like these old ancient Jewish works because I think they shed light on a lot of things we see in the New Testament from time to time. This is again from a writing called the Testament of Dan. It's called that because it's written from the perspective of Dan, the son of Jacob, so one of the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel, father of the tribe of Dan. It's written from his perspective, and the whole idea here, this is him giving his last words of advice to his sons. It's the Testament of Dan, like last will and testament. It's that kind of thing. So this comes from the Testament of Dan. This is, you can't turn there, but just for the sake of reference, chapter 5, verses 1 through 4 is the way they have these divided up. I just want to read this to you. This is from roughly before the time of Jesus, so not too far removed from the time of Jesus himself, just in terms of when this was written down. So this is what this particular author has to say. "Observe the Lord's commandments then, my children, and keep his law. Avoid wrath and hate lying, in order that the Lord may dwell among you, and Beliar may flee from you. Each of you speak the truth clearly to his neighbor, and do not fall into pleasure and troublemaking, but be at peace, holding to the God of peace. Thus no conflict will overwhelm you. Throughout all your life, love the Lord, and love one another with a true heart. For I know that in the last days you will defect from the Lord. You will be offended at Levi and revolt against Judah, but you will not prevail over them. An angel of the Lord guides them both, because by them Israel shall stand. So that's all I wanted to read from that. Now, he gives a list there of several brief commands, that people should obey. But if you notice here, at the very end of that list, he comes around to saying, love God and love other people. He comes down to that. So those two together, joined together, are there in that list. Also notice that they actually came at the end of those list of commandments that he was giving there before he gave his sort of prophetic warning about how Dan's going to go astray and all this and rebel against the two main tribes of Israel. So you have all of that there. You have this kind of summary teaching. That summary ends with a summary that sounds like love God and love your neighbor. It seems like in the Jewish mind at around this general time in history, they were already starting to put love for God and love for other people in a very high place and tying them together in this very moralistic way. It seems like this kind of thing was happening a lot in the days of Jesus. I could add a few more pieces of evidence to the three I'm giving you, but these three are enough to prove my point, and I think they cover a lot of ground in and of themselves. It seems like we have good reason to believe that when Jesus taught that the two greatest commandments were loving God totally and loving your neighbor as yourself, it seems like that was pretty common in his day to say that. It seems like we've got a lot of reason to think that. Now we need to remember this as we consider the answer that Jesus gives to the Pharisees, that he's giving them a common answer. Now, speaking of the Pharisees, let's talk about them in particular. This is my second heading for today. I just want you to remember, as you read this story and think about it, that the Pharisees hate Jesus rather than love him. That is knowledge that we take with us into this passage as we come to read it, that the Pharisees hate Jesus rather than love him. As we consider this event, we should not forget what we already know about the Pharisees, that they not only hate Jesus, but they hate him with a murderous hatred. They have dialed it up to 10. They have gone all the way here in their hatred of Jesus. We've seen this for a good long while so far in Matthew's Gospel. We can go all the way back to Matthew 12. And just to read briefly here, something that we've seen earlier. Matthew 12, verse 14. This is after one of their confrontations with Jesus. It says, "But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him as to how they might destroy him." So, it's not just that they don't like him or that they're annoyed by him. They're trying to destroy him. They want to see him dead on the ground at some point. That is the kind of hatred that they have toward Jesus as early as chapter 12 in Matthew's Gospel. We also see this same kind of hatred with these very Pharisees here in Jerusalem. By the time we arrive at the end of the ministry of Jesus, and he's there in Jerusalem saying all these things and doing all these things, we can see this same kind of hatred in the Pharisees there. In Matthew 21, verse 45 and 46, we see this. This is in the middle of some parables Jesus was telling them earlier. It says, "When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they understood that he was speaking about them. When they sought to seize him, they feared the people because they considered him to be a prophet." So here they are, so angry at Jesus that they want to seize him. We're going to do this right now. We're going to get him into a trial right now. We're going to condemn him to death right now. They wanted to do it then. The only reason they didn't was because all the people were there, and they feared the people. But we see from earlier in Matthew all the way up to this point in Jerusalem, these guys hate Jesus, right? There is no mixture of emotions within them. It's not like they're in conflict about him, and they certainly don't like him. They hate this guy. They hate him very much. Now, my chief application of that memory that we have there of the Pharisees is that we should view the question of these Pharisees as a result of that hatred. By the time that Jesus is there in Jerusalem and all these people are asking him questions, the Pharisees already hate Jesus, and they bring that hatred with them to this question. It's not like it's removed from their hatred. It's part of their hatred. Notice, first of all, from something that Matthew himself tells us, it says that one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. So the whole purpose of this is to test Jesus. Now that implies a few things. For the most part, it implies the possibility of failure. Because when you go to test somebody, there is the chance that they're going to fail. And the reason you're testing them is because you expect they might fail in the very least. That's the whole purpose of a test. And the Pharisees certainly have that mindset toward Jesus. They don't view him as a wise teacher. They view him as a potential failure, and in fact, they would really like him to fail. That's the whole purpose of bringing this test to him. They want to tear him down in front of the crowd in some way. In some way. They want to test him in this fashion so that if he fails, they can point to that and say, see, look, this Jesus isn't so great as you all thought he was. That's what they want. Now, even though they just saw Jesus silence the Sadducees, something the Pharisees could never do, they still think of him as some kind of failure waiting to happen, and they're going to test him to bring this about. They want to show him fail in some way, and therefore they bring this test against him. Secondly, this test shows us that the Pharisees view themselves as capable of testing Jesus. They view themselves as qualified to test Jesus, because that's how a test works, right? It's given from the more knowledgeable person to the less knowledgeable person, and we're going to see how much this other person really knows. That's the whole mindset of someone giving a test, which means the Pharisees consider themselves superior to Jesus. They very much look down their noses at him for his entire ministry because they don't think he knows anything. He shows them up on every occasion, but still they hold to this idea that they're the qualified teachers. They deserve to administer these tests, and they're going to test this guy Jesus again. This is not an honest question. This is a test. This is a test that implies the possibility of failure. Knowing what we know about the Pharisees, we know they want Jesus to fail. We know that from the fact that they're testing Jesus, that they view themselves as superior to him. This is the act of people who have disdain for Jesus. That's why they're testing him. We have to bring that in here. This isn't an honest question. It's not even an honest test. This is a test administered by people who really want Jesus to fail and who view themselves as being greater than Jesus in terms of knowledge. All of that, like their hatred from him starting very early in his ministry, has culminated into this point where they're now going to test him in front of the crowds and try to bring him down as a failure. Which brings us to a great irony, doesn't it? That here they are asking questions about the greatest commandment of the law. Jesus answers them talking about love, and meanwhile, they don't have this kind of love for him. They don't have this kind of love toward Jesus at all. They hate him rather than love him. So here we have this conversation ultimately about love with people that not only hate Jesus, but are displaying that hatred right here, right now, as they talk to him. That irony, I think, should play a very big part in how we understand this passage, which brings me to my third point. This, I think, is the remarkable aspect of how Jesus answers these men. It's not found in him giving an unusual answer, because as I've already said, his answer to them is very common. But how he applies it, that's the remarkable aspect of what Jesus says here. The answer of Jesus is not remarkable for being new, but for being pointed. He applies this directly to the people asking him this question at that moment. In his reply, it seems to me that Jesus makes extra effort to address the hatred of the Pharisees. It seems to me that as he answers them, he wants to put his finger on this very aspect of their character and their attitude toward him. Now, when I say that Jesus makes extra effort, I mean that Jesus provides the Pharisees with two more answers than what they wanted. This is something that maybe you haven't noticed just because you've read this passage so many times and heard it so many times. It's just like, yeah, the two greatest commandments. But when you really think about it, Jesus does more than they asked him to do. Their question was about the great commandment of the law. That was it. What commandment is the great commandment of the law? That was all they asked him. But when Jesus answers, he provides them with two more pieces of information. First of all, Jesus goes further by adding the second greatest commandment about loving your neighbor, even though nobody asked for that. They asked him about one commandment, the greatest. He goes further and gives them the second greatest as well. Okay? Secondly, Jesus adds that these two commandments are the support not only for the whole law, but also the prophets, who were not mentioned by the Pharisees. They asked about the great commandment of the law. They didn't ask anything about the prophets. But Jesus goes further and says that these two commandments support not just the law, but also the prophets. So if this situation is a test, it seems like Jesus is going for bonus points somehow. He's going for some extra credit here in giving some answers to questions that were not asked. And the question that I always ask at this point is why? Why did he do that? He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to give extra information. And Matthew didn't necessarily need to record that for us either, did he? So why is this here? Why did Jesus answer them the way he did? And why did Matthew bother to record it? Well, my own answer is that both of these extra answers further condemn the hatred shown by the Pharisees on this occasion during this test that they posed to Jesus. Let's take each of them by itself. The Pharisees asked about the great commandment. Okay, we know that. Jesus adds the second greatest commandment, which the Pharisees were breaking at that very moment, and really had been breaking for the past several years in all of their interactions with Jesus, and were breaking as they were plotting his murder and trying to find an occasion to seize him so they could trump up charges against him and get him murdered. They've been breaking this commandment for a long time and are breaking it right now with their snide attitude toward Jesus, trying to bring him down before the crowds. They're breaking that commandment right here, right now. And for the record, I just want to go back and actually read what that commandment says, because it really brings some further points of accusation against the Pharisees right here when you think about the background of it. Leviticus 19 is the source for this. Leviticus 19, verses 17 through 18. So as I read this, let's remember that here are these men who hate Jesus, asking Jesus about ethics, basically, about morality and what God requires. He answers them, unprompted to do this, by giving them the second greatest commandment about loving your neighbor, which says this. It says, "You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. You may surely reprove your neighbor, but you shall not incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." Now, Jesus is in line with that commandment because he very often does reprove the Pharisees. That is permitted by this commandment. That is not contrary to love at all to rebuke somebody when they are actually in the wrong. The Pharisees, however, most certainly hold a grudge, which the commandment says specifically you should not do against any of your countrymen. Not only do they hold a grudge, they are definitely trying to take vengeance. I mean, they want to bring Jesus down. They want to see him dead. They will not be happy until he is nailed to that cross. So they're very much going toward vengeance despite this commandment from God. And that, I think, is why Jesus goes further and doesn't just stop at the great commandment, but goes on to the second greatest commandment, because here are these men who assume they have the right to test Jesus on matters of morality while breaking the second greatest commandment, a commandment which they would have known was the second greatest commandment because it was a very common teaching in the days of Jesus. That, I think, is why Jesus goes one step further in answering them by providing the second greatest commandment. It is a pointed rebuke of their own lack of holiness on this point. That explains why he goes on to the second greatest commandment. Now, what about the reference to the prophets? Why does he bring them into this? Why bring in the prophets and not just the law? Well, I think it has much the same purpose, and that is to function as a rebuke to these Pharisees right then and there. Don't forget that we just got done with a conversation between Jesus and the Sadducees. And what's one of the defining points of the Sadducees? They do not accept the prophets as Scripture. They only accepted the law. And that was a big point of debate between the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the days of Jesus. And the Pharisees probably prided themselves on being the people who accept the whole Bible, which for them would have been the law and the prophets and the writings, right? So here they are, the Sadducees, yeah, they got these problems. They only accept the law, but we're right. We accept the entire Scripture as being the Word of God, not just the law, but also the prophets. So there they are, priding themselves on this point. However, Jesus points out to them that it does them very little good because they're not even following the prophets. They refuse to obey the law when it says to love your neighbor. They're not even obeying the prophets either. I think he brings the prophets into this to show them, hopefully, they probably didn't get the picture here, but to show them that they don't even live by the Scriptures they claim to believe. Here they are priding themselves over and against the Sadducees for accepting all of the Word of God, but they don't even follow it. You know, their guilt is maybe even twice as bad because they claim to believe the prophets, but they don't follow their teachings either. They don't follow the teachings of the prophets or the law. And that, I think, is why Jesus brings the prophets into this. It's an implied rebuke to them for not following the Scriptures they claim to believe on this point of love. And that, I think, is why Jesus goes with these extra points here in this conversation with the Pharisees. I think they're very fitting. They seem like they're just extra credit, but they're really directed at these men who are asking this question at this moment. So again, the answer of Jesus is not remarkable for being new, but for being a pointed treatment of the hatred shown by the Pharisees during the ministry of Jesus and at that moment. The Pharisees come to Jesus with a test, but Jesus effectively reverses that test and shows how they fail their own test. They're coming here asking questions about the law and obedience to God. They don't obey God. They don't obey the law. They don't obey the prophets either. And Jesus makes it a point on this occasion to imply that to them, at least very strongly imply it in the way he answers them. And that, I think, is why he gives these extra pieces of information that he gives. Now we come to my fourth heading here for today, and here we're going to break away a little bit from Jesus and the Pharisees and what's going on there. I want to talk about Matthew and what he's doing as he writes this part of his gospel. I think perhaps that Matthew became a little bit excited at this point and wanted to do something sort of in the same vein where he presents this implied rebuke of these Pharisees for failing to obey God, even as they think they are qualified to test Jesus on obedience to God. I think Matthew does something here. He includes a detail in this passage that shows that the Pharisees not only hate their neighbor, Jesus, but they also hate God as well. And it's a very subtle detail. It's the kind of thing you're going to miss unless you're really thinking about it, and maybe even if you really study this passage, maybe then you'll see it. But it's a detail that could easily be missed, and I want to talk about it here. Now, when it comes to this point that I'm going to make, this idea about hating God, just pause here for a minute. That's a very strong claim to make, isn't it? That someone hates God. I mean, if you're going to claim that somebody hates other people, all right, that's something that's probably going to be pretty visible, something that you can point to, you did this, you did that, that's my proof that you hate this person. To claim that somebody hates God is a pretty difficult claim to make because it's difficult to prove. Because they're going to say, well, you can't judge my heart. You can't judge my heart on that. You don't know what I really feel. You don't know what I really think in here. And the great problem that comes along with that is a lot of those people who react in that way are actually oblivious to what's in their heart. They actually don't know that. It's actually possible, and this is something maybe for you kids to realize here as you're thinking about these things. It is possible to hate God and not know it. This is something that is just really difficult to convey to a person of any age. I'm not just picking on you children, but I want you to know this because you've probably never encountered this before. It's possible to hate God while thinking you love God. And I made mention of this at the very beginning, but I just want to talk about it here and now. It is possible to hate God and not realize it. These Pharisees are a chief example of this. They don't love God. That's one of the points that Matthew is going to make here. However, if you were to ask them, do you love God? They would say, well, of course I love God. Of course I do. How could I not love God? And that's usually how people respond to this kind of thing. But it is possible to hate God and not realize it. And I think these Pharisees are a great example of this. Now, this is going to be a very roundabout argument, but I want you to follow me on this. I want to go to Psalm 2, and I'm just going to read very briefly from the first 2 verses of Psalm 2. And you're not going to see the connection. You're not, but we'll get there. I want to read the psalm first so that you can get the background here. Psalm 2 begins like this. Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, or Messiah, saying, and then it goes on to what they actually say in their rebellion. They say, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us, is their great claim there. All right, so there's the image here. We have the kings and the rulers of the nations gathering together against the Lord and against his anointed. So against God and against the Messiah. That's the picture here that we have from Psalm 2. Now, eventually, the Jews translated this psalm and the rest of the Old Testament into Greek. That's the Septuagint translation. And when they did that, they described this gathering here with a phrase that I am going to read to you, just because I want you to hear it for later. Sunekthesan epita auta is the phrase they use, which roughly means they gathered into the same place. Okay, now again, Stan, why are you telling me that? Hold on, we got to go somewhere else first. Acts chapter 4. And I'm going to Acts chapter 4 because this is an example of Christians and how they understood this psalm and how they applied it. Now, Psalm 2 is understood throughout the New Testament as being about Jesus and being about the opposition that the world has toward Jesus. And you see that in Acts chapter 4. This is an event after the apostles were brought before the Sanhedrin and had a bit of a confrontation there. Acts 4, verses 24 through 27 says this, When they heard this, they lifted their voices to God with one accord and said, O Lord, it is you that made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, who by the Holy Spirit through the mouth of our father David, your servant, said, Why did the Gentiles rage and the peoples devise futile things? The kings of the earth took their stand, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ. For truly in this city, this is Jerusalem, by the way, in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. It's like, okay, so here's the Christians, they're reflecting on Psalm 2, they apply it to Jesus, they apply it to the opposition against Jesus. Did you notice that they include Jewish leaders in that? It's not just the leaders of other nations that are opposed to God and opposed to God's Messiah. It's also the people of Israel and Herod and people that were right there in Jerusalem, in that city, who were opposing Jesus. Okay, well, what does all this matter for Matthew? Let's go back to Matthew. Let's read this again here. Matthew 22, verse 34. But when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together. Okay, they're gathering themselves together. Now, when Matthew wrote that, he used a phrase, Sunekthesan epita auta, from Psalm 2 as it was translated into Greek. So this is a very, very subtle detail, I admit that. But he basically quotes Psalm 2 in describing what the Pharisees are doing at this moment. This phrase that was used to describe the gathering of the rulers of the world against God and against his Messiah. Matthew used that to describe the Pharisees on this occasion. It's a phrase that, again, you're not going to notice that unless you've really dug down and studied these things, but it is there. And once you see it, it's one of those things you can't unsee. It's a quotation to Psalm 2. Now, what does this mean? It means that, as Matthew tells the story, this test from the Pharisees is the beginning of the gathering of the rebels that are going to oppose God and oppose the Messiah. The people are gathering. The nations of the world are gathering right here, right now, as these Pharisees come forward. That is how Matthew portrays this to us as he records this event. Now, all that to say, again, I said this was a very roundabout argument, and that's certainly true. But what that means is these Pharisees don't just have the problem of breaking the second greatest commandment by hating Jesus. These are men who are gathering against God himself. So this is the kind of thing, you can imagine these Pharisees reading Psalm 2 and thinking, yeah, those Gentiles, those dirty dogs, they're always rebelling against the Lord. They don't care about God. When the Messiah comes, they'll rebel against him too. They would think of it as being entirely outward, as being all those other people out there outside of Israel. They're the ones to blame for rebellion against God. Matthew says, no, you're part of it. You Pharisees are a part of this. You're part of this rebellion that's gathering together against God and against the Messiah. Which means, quite as a surprise to the Pharisees, they don't just hate Jesus, they hate God himself. Because it's against the Lord and against his anointed that these people are gathering together in Psalm 2. So here are these Pharisees going about their business, thinking they stand for God. I have no doubt in my mind that these men thought that they were taking a stand for the Word of God and the ways of God as they were opposing Jesus there. But really, they're the problem. They're the rebels. They're the ones that hate God. And everything going on there in that passage is a symptom of that hatred that they have for God. Just think about this in terms of Jesus. Here comes Jesus. He's a man of God. He even teaches the two greatest commandments the way other rabbis would have taught them. Love God and love your neighbor. What is actually wrong here? What is the problem with Jesus? The only problem is he has the courage to say when people are not doing what they ought to be doing. He has the courage to call out hypocrisy when he sees it, and he's done it to these Pharisees on multiple occasions. Well, the Pharisees, rather than humbling themselves before that, they hate that. But what's the real problem here? If you hate a man of God, who do you really hate? You hate God himself. If they're finding fault with Jesus, they're really finding fault with the God who stands behind Jesus and backs up everything he says. You got to see these as connected. And of course, there's a very strong connection between loving God and loving your neighbor, and I'll get to that in later sermons in this series that I have in mind. But just note this for now. Matthew portrays these Pharisees as being among the enemies of God, which means they hate God, and their hatred of Jesus is actually a symptom of something much deeper. They don't really love God. They love, Jesus will get into that. They love the praise of men and things like that. And that is why they became the hypocrites that they became. But for here and now, I just want to make this note. The way Matthew tells this story, the hatred of the Pharisees toward God is on display in this passage. They are, in fact, the beginning of this gathered rebellion that Psalm 2 predicted back when David wrote it. All right, let's bring this to the end here. I said that in this passage, Christ shows his own moral insight against the immoral foolishness of his enemies. And that is basically my fifth heading for today. He shows his own moral insight against the immoral foolishness of his enemies. Now, during this event, the Pharisees are, as always, blind leaders of the blind. And that is a phrase we get from Jesus. Just to read you the passage where he first says that. Matthew 15, verses 12 through 14, on some earlier confrontation, says, "The disciples came and said to him, 'Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this statement?' But he answered and said, 'Every plant which my heavenly Father did not plant shall be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind. And if a blind man guides a blind man, both will fall into a pit.'" So here they are, the blind leaders of the blind. This is how Jesus describes the Pharisees. A blind man cannot see what is plainly in front of him because, after all, he is blind. And the Pharisees cannot see the truth of any situation, no matter how plain it may be. They have become spiritually blind to any matter of truth, to the point where when Jesus teaches them truth, they get all offended. That, of course, is the pattern of the ministry of Christ as he relates to these Pharisees. Now, in the case of that conversation later in Matthew, the plain truth is that these Pharisees disobey the greatest of God's commandments and do so blindly, even as they presume to test another man's knowledge. Here they come sauntering in, thinking themselves superior, thinking they're going to test Jesus, trying hopefully to make him fail somehow in front of the crowds, all of which is a symptom of their deep hatred for him and their even deeper hatred for God himself. But here they are thinking that they can test Jesus on questions of morality and ethics and what God requires. They're just blind to themselves, aren't they? These are men who honestly do not know what is in their own heart. Here they come in thinking that they're the representatives of holiness in Israel. They're not holy. They're totally blind to the hatred that is within them, both for God and for their neighbor. They don't see it. They don't see it at all. These men, they have a blind hatred, literally quite, for Jesus. At least in terms of spiritual terms, they cannot see the hatred they have for him. And they do not realize that they themselves fail, even as they presume to be teachers and people qualified to administer this test to Jesus. They just don't see it. You see their immoral foolishness on display. They don't realize it, but we read this and we see it. Another way to contrast the moral insight of Jesus with the immoral folly of the Pharisees is to think about the difficulty level of the question. Now, this is something that might not, again, it's not kind of an obvious thing, but I want you to think about this. On the one hand, I suppose we could consider this sort of question very difficult. After all, you're trying to summarize, really, the law and the prophets. You're trying to summarize all of that into 2 commandments, right? How do you do that? How do you summarize all of the Old Testament in just 2 commands? Well, it seems kind of difficult, but as I have argued, it seems that the Jews had a very common answer to this question. I made the argument at the very beginning of this sermon that loving God and loving other people seems to have been a common way for the Jews to summarize the law at this time in their history. So if that was the case, and if it was a common teaching, it may not have been such a difficult question at this time, right? It's the kind of thing that other rabbis are teaching. You've probably heard it before. You know the answer, so therefore the question is not difficult. Also consider this. What kind of person might be taught that common teaching? Think again back to these days, synagogues and all this kind of thing. You're there growing up in Israel, okay? And you're slowly being taught these kinds of things. You're being taught the scriptures. You're being taught what God requires of his people. At what point do you think you encounter this very simplified version of the law? Well, my guess is as a child, right? Because as a child, you're not able to process all the 636 or however so many commandments of the Torah that there are. You're not ready for things about sacrifices and cleanliness and when to wash and animals you can eat. You're not really ready for all of that. You're going to make this basic. You need these basic truths for just starting off here, how to learn to serve God. So your rabbi, as he is schooling you in these things, he says, look, focus on these 2 things. Love God with all your heart, soul, and your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the rest will fill in as you get older, but here right now, at this time, just think about those 2 things. You can see that happening. You can see how this simplified version of the law that we have here in front of us would have been primarily given to children, maybe people of more simple mind who just have a really hard time learning a lot of things in detail. Those kinds of people. Maybe also Gentile converts, people that are kind of new to this whole God thing. They're new to the religion of Israel, but they want to be a part of it. So they're being trained in these things. So step 1, what is a summary of the law? Love God totally, love your neighbor as yourself. The rest we fill in as you get further along in learning these things. So these kinds of things here, this idea of these 2 great commandments, it seems like the kind of thing that you would give beginners, people that are just starting off and learning these things. Now, this is the question that the Pharisees asked Jesus. Think about this. Jesus is a nationally known rabbi by this point. He's got crowds of people following him everywhere he goes. And people are listening to him. People are listening to him perhaps more than the Pharisees these days. He's not a nobody. I mean, Jesus is the celebrity of Israel at that time. And the Pharisees come in here asking him a question that was probably designed for children. Now, just think about that for a minute here. This could be what's going on in this passage. This could be an insulting, degrading thing for them to ask Jesus at this point. Here you have this nationally known rabbi healing people. No one denies that he can heal people. Not even the Pharisees deny that. The guy has crowds following him around, hanging on every word he says, and you come in here and you ask him a question designed for children, designed for beginners. Is that what's happening here? Now, I know this is kind of reading between the lines and everything, but if that is the case, what kind of attitude do these Pharisees have toward Jesus at this point? I mean, everyone's listening. They're there in the temple. You got these crowds gathering around, and they come in there asking him this patronizing question designed for beginners. I mean, what kind of pettiness is that? This is just such a... I mean, it's not even worth asking at this point. I mean, why would you ask him this question? I just have to wonder here, is this what's going on here? Are they in there? Is this test really kind of an insult at the same time? Trying to insult the intelligence of Jesus. Now, here they are doing this. Are they even thinking about what they're doing here? I mean, these are the holy of the holy, right? These are the Pharisees. These are the people that are supposed to be the holiest people of the entire nation. And they come in there, they've got a crowd witnessing these things. They're talking to Jesus, and their plan is basically to insult him with a question designed for a child. Is that what's going on? Maybe. But I mention that because I think it shows you another angle of the attitude they have and how blind they are to it. I mean, that's like me taking one of you from the crowd here and picking on you, trying to show how little you know by asking you questions designed for beginners. Hey, who's the Son of God? Bet you don't know that one, do you? Idiots. Like what kind of attitude is that? That's the attitude that these men seem to have as they approach Jesus. And they're doing this for all to see. They honestly cannot see the pettiness and the spite they have for Jesus, or they just don't care. Either one of those would be a problem. And these are the men who are presuming to test Jesus at this point, and who have presumed to oppose him throughout his entire ministry. All that to say, again, is just another way in which they seem to be blind to what they do. They seem to be blind to who they are. They just don't get themselves, do they? They don't seem to have a very good understanding of what's in their own hearts. They don't understand the moral implications of their own actions. They're just blind. They are totally and completely blind to themselves. And again, these are the people that probably had more respect than anyone else in the entire nation at that time, which doesn't really bode well for the entire nation, does it? If these are the men that are lifted up as the holiest of the holy. Anyway, all that to say, you've got these blind leaders of the blind. They don't seem to be very aware of their own foolishness, and Jesus, in the way he interacts with them, tries to show them that by pointing out their own lack of attention to the second greatest commandment, their own disregard for the prophets. And Matthew, I think, joins in there with this quote of Psalm 2, implying their own hatred for God. So there's a lot happening here. I mean, this is a very simple passage in a lot of ways. I mean, it's about the two greatest commandments. As I said, those are the kinds of things that we teach children as they're just learning things. So again, very simple, but a lot of detail here that when you think about it, there's a lot happening between Jesus and the Pharisees, and there's a lot that I think Matthew wants us to see. So let me give you a summary here at the end, and we'll maybe close this down with one other insight here. First, Jesus answers this question with a common teaching about the primacy of love. I made the argument that it seems like there were other people in Israel at this time teaching these two commandments as a summary of the law, so it seems like his answer is pretty common. Second heading was that the Pharisees hate Jesus rather than love him. We see that throughout his entire ministry, and we see that just in them coming to test him at this time and their own attitude toward him. Thirdly, in his reply, Jesus makes the extra effort to address the hatred of the Pharisees by bringing in the second greatest commandment, which they're breaking at that moment, and by bringing in the prophets, whom they also disregard as they disregard the law. And then fourthly, the Pharisees not only hate their neighbor, Jesus, but also hate God, which Matthew shows by bringing in this reference to Psalm 2, showing them to be among the rebellion against God that David talks about in Psalm 2. And then finally, again, Christ shows his own moral insight against the immoral foolishness of his enemies. He shows them by answering them the way he does, just trying to bring out to them in some way their own blindness and how little they see themselves for the sinners that they are. And that is the blind hatred of the Pharisees, and mainly what I wanted to say today. I just wanted to apply this here at the very end in a way that I don't think we usually do. And again, we're used to taking the Pharisees and kind of stringing them up and beating them in front of us just to use them as bad examples. What's going on here in their minds? Here they are, as Paul said later in the letter to the Romans, these are the kind of men, they have zeal without knowledge. They have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. The Pharisees are very much in that vein of things. I mean, here they are. They think they're following God. They're blind to what they really are underneath all of that. But here they are in their misguided zeal, opposing Jesus all this time. And that's the kind of hatred they had. Now, it might be hard for us to see the application there. I mean, after all, we're not Pharisees, are we? Are we? Sure hope not. But it's the kind of thing where you could fall into the same kind of sin without knowing it. For example, let's say you meet someone, a Christian, who comes to you with some kind of reproof, which is something you're allowed to do according to Leviticus 19, that is in keeping with love to your neighbor. In some way this person calls you out for things you're doing that are not right. What is your response to that? There are two ways to respond to that. One is perhaps the way of the Pharisees, in which you decide that this person does not speak for God, and you sort of build up, and it's the kind of thing that happens so gradually. You build up all these reasons in your mind why this person is actually the problem, why he doesn't really serve God, what's wrong with him, and you just work yourself up into this hatred of him without even realizing it. It does happen. I mean, it's one of the great risks here among Christians, among professing Christians, among religious people generally, just to have that kind of spite toward people who have the courage to point out something that is wrong in you. That is a very common response. Now, another response maybe there are three ways to respond to that. You could heed the rebuke, you could humble yourself before it, and you actually change your ways. But what if, let's just put this third example here in front of you. What if here you are and you don't see it? This person comes to you with a rebuke, some kind of challenge, and you honestly don't see it. You feel like you have examined yourself and you don't really think there's a problem there. You now have this kind of awkward situation, don't you, with this other person, in that this person thinks that there is some kind of wrongdoing on your part, and you disagree with that. You honestly disagree with that. What kind of relationship do you now have with that person? It could be really difficult to show love to that kind of person on a regular basis, just because of the way they have approached you about this thing and you don't see it yourself. It could be easy to maybe not handle that well. And I'm saying from experience here just things that I have seen. It's really important on occasions like that are difficult and awkward and could give rise to certain hatreds and jealousies and things like that, to remember these kinds of teachings. Because remember, the Pharisees, they don't see it. Just because you don't see what hatred you have doesn't mean it isn't there. It's the kind of thing where you have to make the effort to guard against it. So here we are, Christians, trying to follow these things, trying to escape the errors that we see in men like the Pharisees. Don't think Satan isn't clever. I mean, he can work these kinds of things into your life without you even realizing it. You have to be on constant guard. And there are going to be these situations that arise where just like you have to make the deliberate effort to show love to these people who might be difficult to love, even in ways that are just very uncommon. I mean, it's easy when someone comes to you with obvious malice. I mean, in a sense, you got to be on your guard then against hating that person in return because it's so clear. But what about these other kinds of things, these kind of very religious things where someone comes to you with some sort of disagreement, some kind of challenge to you, some kind of rebuke? That can be a real occasion for a problem if you're not guarding against that. I don't know how much any of that makes sense. Maybe you think it just misses the mark. But as I think about how we apply these kinds of things, the applications are not going to be obvious. If they were obvious, we'd all be sinless by now. Okay, you got to look out for the occasions where Satan has worked out some real clever trap for you, and you're not even going to think about these things. The prospect of whether you're loving your neighbor as yourself in this case isn't going to occur to you. You have to make it occur to you. You have to bring it to your mind frequently, and make sure it's there as you think about your relations with other people. It's the kind of thing to look out for because it's very easy not to. Okay, well, that's all I had to say on this part of things. In my next sermon, just so you know where I'm going next, if you were following along earlier when I was reading from Mark's Gospel and you saw the differences that are there between Matthew and Mark, you might be wondering how some of those work well together, how they can be the same event. I'm actually going to talk about that next time. So next time I actually want to go over to Mark, compare him to Matthew, answer some questions that maybe arise when you start comparing those things, and deal with those things. It'll be a relatively short sermon, but I feel like I want to do that just because it's the kind of questions people tend to have. So that will be my sermon next time. Are there any questions or comments about the things that I was talking about today on this particular phase of the series?